that was our drawing activity, and to refresh those different parts of the sarcomere I want you to know. Again, those Z lines, again, this is why I think of them informally as zigzag lines. These are the ones that anchor these actin filaments. And not only that, they form the border of a sarcomere. And again, this is why I like to think of it as a sarcomere, because they are between Z lines. And then you have these parts that only have actin. Again, these are so thin, the actin is so thin, it's almost invisible in this picture. So these are the I bands. And then, again, so thin, they're almost invisible. And then we have this part right here, the M line straight in the middle of all that myosin. And then we have the H zone. So this is why I like to think of it as like the heavy only zone. Again, heavy only is not an official term. That's just how I remember, like, this part that only has myosin is the H zone. And then this part that contains all of the myosin and also some actin, this is the A band. And actually the A band and I bands, they are complementary. They do not overlap. So they have actin and myosin. And then this part where they overlap, that's simply the zone of overlap. So that's pretty easy. And I'll upload this later, so don't worry if you didn't get it. And you can practice it multiple times if you like the drawing activity. So what changes during sarcomeric shortening? So again, sarcomere is that border between two Z lines, and you actually have multiple sarcomeres along the length of a myofibril. The thing is that, again, you have here we have our myosin, here we have the M line, we have the actin, we have our Z lines. And remember those myosin, they have all those heads that pull on actin. So by pulling on the actin, what happens to the Z lines? Well, this is the sarcomere, but as they pull the actin, what happened to the Z lines? Yeah, notice that the Z lines are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And now what happens? Remember, the Z lines form the border of the sarcomere. So the sarcomere overall got shorter. So this is why we call it sarcomeric shortening. By myosin pulling on actin, it pulls the Z lines closer together. That shortens the sarcomere. That shortens the overall length of a skeletal muscle. So that's why sarcomeric shortening is, that's why they call it that. Okay, muscle twitch and muscle tension. So twitch, besides being one of the best streaming platforms out there, is like, okay, now it's one of the single contraction produced by one action potential. That's the OpenStack's definitions. But the thing is that this is my like easier version of this. And if you go on to like kinesiology or advanced A&P or any advanced courses, do not carry these simplified versions of my definitions. But when you're starting out, I think this is an easier way to explain it. So what I think is like, okay, a single contraction just produced by a signal. So you get some sort of neuronal signal, some sort of action potential, and then that causes a contraction of muscle. That's it. But tension, I had a hard time finding a really good like a simple physiology definition for tension. So at this point, again, this is why I use a little asterisk. It's easiest to just think of as the force resulting from a twitch at this point. Now here we have, oh wow, so sarcomere length and active tension. And this is a common thing you'll see in physiology. Physiologists love graphs, very dense graphs that are really hard to get at first. But if you break it down, it's not too bad. I'll help break this one down for you. And I think the OpenStack's version is a little even more abstract than this. So what we have here is on the x-axis, this is just saying how much space you have between the Z lines, the sarcomere length, right? So basically how stretched out a muscle is. So this is a normal range. And what we have here, okay, just when you have the normal range of tension, is that all the paddles, they're on, if you're using the paddler analogy, all the paddles are in the water. So for myosin and actin, all the myosin heads are onto actin. So they're able to grab onto actin if there is release of tropomyosin from actin. Now, what happens when you lengthen it? Well, the thing is that when you lengthen it, what happens is that, look at all the myosin heads. Instead of having all the myosin heads on actin, now you notice that only a few myosin heads are on actin, but these are kind of swimming around in space. So instead of all paddles being in the water, it's kind of like this. These guys only this guy is still paddling. They're like celebrating. No one else has their paddles in the water. Now, compared to the first picture where everyone had their paddles in the water, who's going to generate more force? When you have all paddles in the water, or when you have some paddles up in the air and only a few in the water? So again, all paddles in the water are going to generate more force. But if you have some up swimming out in the air, you're going to generate less tension. You're going to generate less force because you don't have that cross bridge. You don't have that actin myosin, as many actin myosin cross bridges forming. Now, what happens if you're all the way out here and you're stretching out that sarcomere way longer? Well, notice that as the more you stretch out a sarcomere in a muscle, you have fewer myosin heads grabbing onto actin. If it's fully extended or overextended like this, notice that all these myosin heads have no actin to grab onto. So using our paddler analogy, what's it like? It's like having no paddles in the water. So if you have no paddles in the water, do you have any force generated? Nope, you don't get any force. So again, as you stretch out a muscle and sarcomere longer and longer, you have fewer and fewer myosin able to grab onto actin because there's a certain limit where they're no longer able to interact with each other. Now, why does it drop off on the other side? So we know all the myosin and actin, myosin heads and actin are acting at this range, but why does it drop off if you shorten a sarcomere? Well, it's like this. Well, you do have all the paddles in the water, but how much room do you have at this point? Well, it's kind of like you have all your paddles in the water, but you have a wall right here. So they're generating a lot of force, but they hit that wall really soon. So compared to when they have a lot of open space to work out in and paddle versus only a short distance before they hit the dock, who's going to generate more force? The one with all that space or the one with just very little wiggle room to do that? Or if you like, so again, it's like, this is why do you generate less tension if your sarcomeres are too short, because they kind of run into a physical barrier. Or if they're already at that barrier, that's like being at the wall already. So you're not going to generate any force. They can paddle all they want, but if they have it, they won't be moving anywhere if they're already stuck up against the wall. So that's why when you have the sarcomeres very short, you can't generate as much tension.